We're tackling the Sandy Hook Elementary shooting,
Yeah, absolutely.
trying to make sense of, I guess, the senseless,
Right.
But we're going to stick to the facts here. Using the sources you provided,
Okay.
we'll lay out the timeline, who was involved, and really try to grapple with the impact this event continues to have even all these years later.
Yeah, and it's so important, I think, to remember that we're not just talking about numbers here.
Right.
These were real people, families, an entire community devastated.
Absolutely.
And this wound, it runs deep, especially in Newtown, Connecticut. That's where it all happened, December 14th, 2012.
December 14th, 2012, a date I think a lot of us unfortunately remember all too well. So let's go back to that day. Can you tell us about Adam Lanza, the individual responsible for this tragedy?
Lanza was 20 years old at the time, and the reports indicate a history of mental health issues, although the specifics are, they're complex.
Yeah.
Still a lot of debate there.
Right.
But what we do know for sure is that before going to the school, he fatally shot his own mother, Nancy Lanza, at their home.
And then at the school, he just unleashed this unimaginable horror, taking the lives of 26 people.
It's hard to fathom.
20 children, just 6 and 7 years old, and 6 educators, the people who were there to protect them, to teach them.
Trying to shield them.
It's heartbreaking. And, something I've always wondered about is school security, right? It's such a focus these days.
Right.
So how was Lanza able to get past those measures, those security protocols that were in place?
He actually shot through a plate glass window. It was right next to the main entrance. So he completely bypassed all the security they had set up.
Wow.
And this one detail has really haunted, I think, security experts and school administrators ever since.
Yeah. Because
it forces them to confront this really tough question. How do you truly fortify a school against someone so determined to inflict harm?
It's a chilling thought. It really highlights the vulnerability of places we think of as safe, like schools. But even in the midst of this darkness, we do know that there were incredible acts of courage that day. Teachers, staff, immediately going into lockdown, hiding those students, likely saving lives.
Absolutely. Their actions were heroic. The principal, Dawn Hawksprung, and the school psychologist, Mary Sherlach, they actually confronted Lanza directly.
Oh, wow.
And in doing so, they sacrificed their own lives. But their bravery, their selflessness, it really speaks to the dedication of everyone who works in education.
It's just awe-inspiring. Now, thankfully, law enforcement arrived within minutes, and Lanza ultimately took his own life before they could engage him directly, which prevented further loss of life. But of course, the trauma, the ripple effects, they didn't end there.
No, of course not. You have families, an entire community left to grapple with this unimaginable loss. And what I find really remarkable is how many of those families channeled their grief into action. They became really powerful advocates for change.
Can you give us some specific examples of that, of how those families channeled their grief into action?
Absolutely. A lot of the victims' families came together. They formed organizations like the Sandy Hook Promise Foundation.
I've heard of that.
And they took their grief and turned it into this mission to prevent future tragedies through education, mental health awareness, and really pushing for changes in policy. They've done incredible work in raising awareness and getting better mental health resources out there.
That's powerful. This tragedy, it also reignited a national debate about gun control, especially focusing on the type of weapon that Lanza used.
Yeah, the fact that he used a Bushmaster XM15 E2S rifle, which is an AR-15 style firearm, that really sparked a really heated debate. AR-15s have been used in so many mass shootings that it's become a real focal point in this whole discussion about gun control. And you have arguments about, how lethal it is, how it appeals to people who might want to do harm, and then the whole debate about the Second Amendment and whether it's constitutional to restrict access to these types of firearms. It's a really tough conversation with very strong opinions on both sides.
It's interesting you say that because you think about the public outcry after Sandy Hook.
Yeah.
I mean, it was huge. So what were the main obstacles then to passing stricter gun control laws?
Well, even though there was this huge public push for some measures like universal background checks, it's such a politically charged issue. You have these very powerful lobbying efforts on both sides. And despite a lot of attempts, federal legislation really hasn't changed gun laws in the U.S. all that much. So it's complicated, right? It's tied up with how people interpret the Second Amendment and really deep cultural values around gun ownership.
Yeah, it's a conversation that's far from over. But even with the shadow of this tragedy, there are glimmers of hope.
Absolutely. The resilience of the Newtown community is truly inspiring. And in 2016, a new Sandy Hook Elementary School was built. It's a symbol of healing, of rebuilding, of a community determined to move forward.
That's a powerful image. So I guess the question is, where does this leave us? What can we learn from Sandy Hook, and how can we actually work to prevent future tragedies like this?
It's a question we all need to grapple with, I think.
Yeah.
How do we balance individual rights with keeping our communities safe? How can we do a better job identifying and addressing mental health concerns before they escalate? How do we create a culture that values empathy, understanding, and having these difficult conversations responsibly?
It's tough, but it's a conversation we can't afford to shy away from.
Exactly.
Maybe by understanding the past, we can find a way to create a safer future.
I hope so.